I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma, which is where I went to high school, and I grew up eating the same thing everybody else in the Midwest was eating.
I'm born in Brooklyn, and I think I ate the African American diet. I can't merely say the American diet because much of the African American experience and diet was it had to be fried, oiled, fat, sugar, sweet, salty. It was the diet that we were raised on, and that was my typical diet.
I ate a very typical American diet. Lots of processed meat, hot dogs, hamburgers, spaghetti.
I grew up on the coast of Maine. We had a garden in the backyard. I started hunting when I was 8 or 10 years old. My dad always took me fishing. We weren't into gourmet food necessarily, but we definitely lived by the seasons, off the land a little bit, even though we lived in a small town that wasn't considered country.
So my dad is from Cuba and my mom is Colombian, so growing up we ate a lot of meat, pork, and just a lot of animal products, like really heavy products, especially on holidays. Like Cubans will roast pigs and stuff on Christmas and stuff like that, so we just grew up eating a lot. Eggs and everything, lots of animal products.
My mom would make this dish called Cracks chicken, which came from my grandmother with these sort of crackers, or like Ritz crackers. I'm Jewish, we grew up in a kosher home, and she would make this dish, and on Friday nights we'd have that with some chicken soup, and it was very traditional type of stuff. She'd have brisket some nights with potatoes and broccoli, and it was just, that was sort of very common to have those kinds of things. It would be a treat to go out for Chinese food or go out for pizza, and but it was a pretty mainstream type household.
In high school, in Oklahoma, the food groups were really McDonald's Big Macs and Dairy Queen Blizzards. So I grew up eating an awful lot of Big Macs, an awful lot of Arby's roast beef, Dairy Queen Blizzards, Kentucky Fried Chicken, those sorts of things.
I grew up predominantly on Italian, soul food, as well as traditional American food. I'm the oldest of 3 in my family, only girl. And my parents actually taught my brothers and I how to cook breakfast food and make our own lunches from time to time, but we also indulged in a lot of junk food.
I was growing up eating chicken and hamburgers and having a bowl of cereal every morning with milk and milkshakes and ice cream, so I had it all. Yeah.
Fried chicken, steak, smothered pork chop, cake, homemade cake with butter and sugar. You couldn't get any butter, you go get some lard. Spaghetti and meatball, hamburgers, bacon, eggs, cheese, any kind of cheese. Sometimes it would be store-bought. It would be the big block of cheese that they used to give up, the government cheese, the big, welfare cheese they used to give you. Noodles, apple pie, ice cream. It didn't have to be Haagen-Dazs. It could be just anything that was on sale that week. So it was just all the food that you can eat that will just take years off your life.
I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, was born in D.C., went to high school and college in D.C., and I ate a pretty typical American diet, a lot of meat and a lot of eggs and a lot of dairy. In fact, I'm not sure that in my youth I had a single vegan meal ever. It's hard for me to imagine. Maybe I might have had like pasta marinara at one point, but I'm not sure, I don't recall it. But I grew up with dogs in the household, and I loved them so much. They were like my brothers and sisters. In fact, I probably loved them more than my biological family at some points when I was growing up. And so when I started learning more about how farm animals are treated and mistreated, I wondered, what if those are my dogs? What if those are my dogs in those cages or in that slaughter plant? And I didn't want to support that for any animal. If I didn't want it for my own dogs, why would I want it for pigs or cows or chickens? And so I, at age 13, decided to become a vegetarian. And at that time, I'd never heard of anything beyond a vegetarian. I knew that there were vegetarians. I knew about Einstein and Gandhi, and I knew some other people too, but I didn't know anything else. And so there was no internet back then, and I wrote to a lot of organizations, started asking them to send me information about vegetarian eating. And several sent me back things in the mail about what I thought was called being a vegan. I was like, oh, what is this vegan? You know, that looks interesting. So I'm reading about it, and I thought to myself, like, no eggs or dairy or meat. Like, I kind of thought to myself, like, maybe it's kind of like holding your breath. Like, you can hold your breath for some time, but if you do it too long, you die. I thought not eating any animal products at all, like, I would just die, and so I didn't do it. But I started volunteering for animal protection organizations in my area, and over the course of the next few weeks, I met these people who I learned were not vegans, but were vegans, and I remember looking at them like do they look healthy? Do they look too pale? Like, you know, what was it? And when I learned that my then hero, Carl Lewis, the Olympic athlete who was a gold medalist, was a vegan, I was like, okay, I'm in. So pretty quickly after becoming a vegetarian, I became a vegan. And back then, I mean, people didn't know what the word meant. They didn't know how to pronounce it. If anything, they thought you were from Vegas. But it was just a different world. It was 23 years ago. And being a vegan today is a much better experience than back then.
So I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet, in which Francis Moore Lappé makes the fairly basic point that raising crops to cycle them through animals so that we can eat animals is an extraordinarily inefficient way of creating food. And that did it for me all the way back in 1987.
When I turned vegan, I had no idea about the impact it was going to have on my health. All I knew was I worked for animal welfare, I believe in animal welfare, and after seeing firsthand that dairy is responsible for an enormous chain of cruelty and feeds the meat industry, you know, dairy is just a byproduct, that I consciously decided to step away from that chain of cruelty. I mean, I thought it was a moral obligation I had to the work and the mission I've taken on this life.
When I was a junior in high school, I saw a documentary, and it showed how animals are raised and killed for food. It showed how chickens and pigs and cattle were raised and slaughtered. And while seeing this documentary, and especially this footage that was really tough for me to see, my dog came over. He was a big old Saint Bernard. He was like the size of a bear. And he wasn't that friendly. But for some reason he came over, he kind of lumbered along and put his big head on my foot, and that was the only sign of affection he'd ever have. And it really hit me. This connection happened where I saw what's really a difference between those animals who are being raised and killed for food and Hector, my dog. They all can feel pain, they can all suffer. I'm sure they can all feel happiness and joy as well. And so I thought, why love my dog, who frankly wasn't even that friendly and might not care about me too much, but I loved him nonetheless. You know, he's a dog where if you're a child, you just love your dog. Why love him and ignore the plight of these other animals?
In college, I traveled around the country. I learned about the cruelty of factory farming again, learned about the inefficiency of animal agriculture and how we could feed far more people on plants instead of animals. And then I learned that it was possible to live as a vegan because I had grown up believing I needed meat, milk, and eggs to be healthy. And when I learned that I could live well without consuming animal products, without causing that sort of harm, without contributing to the problems that industry caused, it made all the sense in the world, and I went vegan in 1985.
You know, and I wasn't a doctor, but you know what? I was a cop. I knew how to do investigations. I knew how to seek out facts. I knew how to compare analysis and come to conclusions based on the information, not based on my opinion. And the facts were very clear that I was sick because of what I ate. And so, you know, some folks say, well, you know, the jury is still out. What hell courtroom are they in? Jury's not out. It's just a clear guilty plea that the food I ate would cause me to be sick.
I've been vegan about 20 years, and I came from a family that was pescatarian-ish. We actually thought of ourselves as vegetarian, but we ate fish, we ate eggs, we ate dairy, and on holidays, things would go totally off the rails. But I was aware. I was at least on the journey. And then as I learned more as a journalist, I started seeing some of the horrors on video, and I became a vegetarian, but I still was eating dairy. Then I interviewed Howard Lyman. He's the mad cowboy who went on Oprah and exposed the secrets of the cattle industry, and he became a cause célèbre. And he came up to me with his publicist afterwards, and they said, "We hear you're a vegetarian." I said, "Yeah." And they looked at me and they said, "Do you eat dairy?" And I kind of looked down, shamefaced, because they had just explained the horrors of the dairy industry, the baby calves ripped away from their mothers, and just the veal crates, the whole 9 yards. And I kind of went like, well, yeah. And they looked at me and they pointed their finger at me and they said, "Liquid meat." Just those 2 words. I went vegan, and I've never looked back. 20 years, I have incredible energy. I'm 61, I'm full of fun. It's a joyous adventure to be living a cruelty-free lifestyle.
So back in 2005, the China study had just come out, and a few reports had just come out. The American Dietetic Association had come out with a position paper saying vegan and vegetarian diets were healthful and could reduce your risk of several different diseases, and American Heart Association, the American Cancer Association, they were all starting to validate the research that was out there, and that was very surprising to me. You know, I had not known any of that, and without digging into it, it really hadn't hit mainstream circles. And so that kind of really, as I learned more and more, I said, well, I should try this myself. And so I became a plant-based eater, and had great results. I lost 20 pounds, back to my high school weight. My cholesterol went from over 200 to under 140. Just felt energized, started to see my abs again, and workouts became easier. And so I really became, and this was all within the course of 90 days, and so I became a real believer that this is a very beneficial way to eat for my own health.
3 weeks, my vision cleared up. Went back to the doctor, eye doctor. She says, "I don't know what happened, never seen this before, but your vision turned around." 3 months, the tingling in my hands and feet disappeared. The nerve damage in my thigh disappeared. The ulcer in my stomach disappeared. The acid reflux gone. My cholesterol dropped down to a 70, and now it's down to a 57. My PSA went to a 1.1. I just lost my dad to prostate cancer last year. That turned around. My high blood pressure normalized. My body became a new machine because I gave it the right fuel to do what it was supposed to do. And it was nothing but food. And what I learned was so often the doctors I saw in New York who said there's nothing you can do about it, and they gave me all the medicine that I didn't take. I learned as they told me, listen, it was in your mother's DNA, it's in your DNA. It wasn't the DNA, it was my dinner. It wasn't my lineage, it was my lunch. It wasn't who I gave birth to me, it was my breakfast. That was where it was the food.
I grew up in the Washington, D.C. and Maryland area, and I think an important part of my childhood is my dad's a professor, and he's at McGill now in Montreal, but when I was a kid, he was at the University of Maryland. And it was his dream to have a farm, he grew up in the rural area himself as a child, so he wanted to have a farm when we were younger. So at a very young age, for me, he bought a farm up in the western part of the state of Maryland. And it was supposed to be a place to go recreate and just relax. But ultimately, he turned it into a business. We had about 100 head of Holstein cattle there for milk and dairy operation. And so I got to know a lot about animal agriculture through that. And it was a very well-run farm, and the animals were treated with respect. But I learned quite a bit about the amount of resources, for example, that are used for agriculture, and the process of using an animal to create either protein or milk. So I think what's really fascinating to me is I think about the reasons that we started this business, and they're really four, and I talk about them. We call them the 4 horsemen of change. And what's so powerful to me is that if you look at the center of the plate and you say, I can create a piece of meat that seamlessly replaces animal protein with plant protein, I can affect simultaneously 4 really important problems. And I think the first problem is really around human health. You look at heart disease, diabetes, cancer, all these things have been very well documented that have an association with high levels of meat consumption or particularly processed meats. And you go on from that and you look at climate change, and you look at, for me, the study that was very impactful was around what Robert Goodland had done. He was at the World Bank at the time. Or right after he left the World Bank, he did this study where he tried to basically line up all of the contributions from the entire supply chain for livestock toward climate change, whether it's methane or carbon, et cetera. And the analysis said about 51% of greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to livestock. Now that number's been debated. The UN has a lower number, but I've never seen a credible scientific deconstruction of that work yet. And so I continue to believe it's probably the largest driver in terms of global emissions. And so that's the second issue that you can attack. Third is natural resources. We're here in California. We've had 5 of the driest years on record here. It's abnormally warm today, which may just be a natural fluctuation, but it is increasingly apparent that we are impacting the level of resources that we have available to us, growing population, et cetera. So that's the third area. The fourth is animal welfare. And what's been interesting to me in my lifetime is to see that what went from a niche concern by people is now much more mainstream. And I think part of what's driving that is for the first time, technology is taking us closer to the farm rather than further away, right? So if you look at the process of industrialization, most of that took the American consumer away from the farm, right? Today, the ability to see agriculture operations on a handheld video, for example, the undercover stuff that people are doing, kids now have that available to them in a way that we didn't when we were growing up. At least I didn't. You'd have to pick up Upton Sinclair, or you'd have to pick up a book to read about this, or get a pamphlet. Today, it's just as easy as finding it on your phone. So those 4 things, you start with human health, you look at climate change, natural resources, and animal welfare. How amazing to be able to really impact all 4 of those things by making a simple change. If I could just talk a little about what that change is. For me, it's very important to take a step back and think about how we consider meat. And I think over the course of our history, and more recently, we've said, okay, meat is really something that comes from chicken, cows, or pigs. We define meat by its origin, right? And I think you can make a very powerful change if you say, I'm going to define meat mentally. I'm going to think about meat in terms of its composition, not where it came from, but its composition. So meat is essentially 5 things. It's amino acids, it's lipids, it's an incredibly small amount of carbohydrates, it's trace minerals, and it's predominantly water. All of those things are available outside of animals. So if I can present those 5 things to you, and I can present them in the architecture of muscle or meat, who's to say that's not meat, right? It just didn't come from a chicken, cow, or pig. But a landline, you could say a phone has to have something connected to a wall, right? But obviously no one's going to debate that what you have in your hand or what we use today as a cell phone is a phone, right? So I'd like people to more focus on the functionality and the composition of meat. That opens up all of this discussion to real solutions, instead of just trying to increase the efficiency of a pig or a chicken or a cow, which we've tapped out our ability to do that. And also the consumer has said there's ethical considerations if you continue to try to increase the efficiency, whether it's gestation crates or things like that, that they're not willing to go toward.
In the United States, the force of industry is massive, unfortunately. Through a series of laws, the U.S. government actually supports really unhealthy foods. When cheese prices fall, I'm talking about 70% fat, high sodium, high cholesterol cheese, the government buys it and they stick it in schools. They put it in food assistance programs. So you have people who do not need another slice of cholesterol getting it. Also, perhaps even worse, feed grains are subsidized. So let's say I'm raising cattle or pigs, or I'm raising chickens. My biggest cost is feeding them. But the U.S. government subsidizes the corn crops and the soybean crops, not things that we're going to eat, but they're subsidizing cattle feed and chicken feed and hog feed. And that means that meat is cheap. And it means that comparatively that veggie burger might cost a little bit more than the meat burger. And that's skewing the market, unfortunately.
The poor of the world have typically subsisted, whether in Latin America on rice and beans, or in Asia with rice and vegetables, or in the subcontinent, lentils and so on. And it's not to say they were strictly vegetarians, but they eat very little meat. And as they get wealthier, they start to eat more meat because they can afford to be less efficient. But if we want to do the right thing, to have more food, to feed an increasing population, we're not going to be able to continue having such astronomically high rates of meat consumption. It's just not sustainable.
So we've got a food system that's giving an awful lot of people too much and an awful lot of other people too little. And a lot of that distills to the inefficiency and borderline insanity of growing vast quantities of crops to feed those crops to animals so that we can eat those animals. For people who can afford to eat unlimited meat, it leads to diseases of affluence. It leads to obesity and diabetes and heart disease and cancer and other problems. And the market economics of it means that it drives up the price of corn and wheat and oats and other crops, and means that an awful lot of people who are just struggling to get by, they're not able to get food at all.
Well, food is an area that is ripe for innovation. Terms like disruption or the buzzwords in Silicon Valley, well, nothing is riper for disruption than the factory farming industry. This is a dinosaur of an industry. It is archaic. It is so inefficient at producing protein, but it's very efficient at producing environmental harm, public health harm, and certainly animal cruelty.
There are other problems associated with animal agriculture, including the squandering of scarce resources like water, fossil fuels, topsoil. Rainforests are cut down so we can grow vast amounts of grain so we can feed animals. So there's these kinds of environmental hazards and destruction caused by animal agriculture. Got groundwater that's polluted from animal waste. We even have antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the water, in groundwater, underneath these factory farms. So, and then we're eating food that makes us sick.
Scientifically and biologically, humans are not designed to digest the protein in meat, as well as the flesh and the fibers of animal. Our intestines are not divinely designed to intake and process, and definitely not the way that meat is produced these days.
This is food that causes heart disease and cancer, contributes to diabetes, and we're eating food in a very irrational way. We should be eating food that is nutritious and allows us to flourish and live well, but instead we're eating food that makes us sick, and at the same time we're causing billions of animals to suffer and destroying the planet. Makes no sense in the world if you really think about it.
I know that when I see meat on a plate, that there are people that I don't see, that I will never see and never experience, who are starving because of this meal. I know the utter cruelty that went into making this. I know what that animal felt like. I know what this does to our environment. There's so many aspects. You don't need to be a particularly multifaceted person for this to affect you. All you have to do is stop and figure out what the issues are. That's it.
The best minds are aware of this problem. The Sergey Brins of the world know that we have to come up with an alternative, that 9 billion people, which is what we're going to be by 2050, can't eat hundreds of billions of animals. There is no way this planet can sustain it.
Plant-based meats are dramatically more efficient than having to produce meat from animals. And that's one of the reasons why investors are backing these companies, because they look in the world and they want to look at efficiencies to tackle, whether it's in energy, whether it's in medicine, it's in food too.
That's why you're seeing billionaires like Bill Gates and Vinod Khosla and others who are investing in this space now, because they know that there is going to be a huge gain in the future by putting their money into plant-based protein companies.
I think there's a confluence of reasons that consumers are eating more and more plant-based options. For one thing, you've got people like the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and Harvard Medical School educating people about the fact that a big part of our obesity problem, a big part of our sky-high cancer and heart disease rates is the way that we're eating. And people are recognizing that they're eating too much meat and they would like to cut back. People are also learning about the environmental impact of animal agriculture, and especially the climate change impact. They're learning about the unsustainability of these systems. They're learning about the abysmal way that animals are treated on modern farms and in modern slaughterhouses. And people are responding by cutting back on their animal product intake.
Over the last 30 or 40 years, there has been a rapid decline in red meat consumption. And the rate of change actually tracks pretty well with the decline in milk consumption, right? So both of these curves are pretty similar. If you look at what's happened in the dairy case, there's been a proliferation of basically replacements, starting with soy milk, almond, et cetera. There has not been an analogous replacement with regard to meat. And so I think that there's two things going on there. One is that the quality has not been there. So people just aren't willing to make the change over to plant-based meat because it's not good enough yet. But I think second, that the cultural adherence to meat in the United States is vastly stronger than that toward dairy, right? So people are more willing to swap out dairy than they are willing to swap out meat. There's a cultural adherence to this, a cultural importance to meat that is prevailing, and it's been with us for almost 2 million years, prior to even when we were actually humans. So I think it's going to take a long time to make that change. But again, if you can break that perception issue and you can say, hey, I actually am having a piece of meat, it's just meat that came from plants, you can make the change much more rapidly. But the number one driver in the United States around the reduction in meat consumption is human health. And it's, you don't go 6 months without a new study coming out. And that's the thing that's fascinating to me. And the World Health Organization study was very, I think, it made a lot of noise. It had a lot of prominence. If you get the Meeting Place magazine, which I'm sure you don't, but it's the magazine of the meat industry. It was on the front cover, saying this is coming. We have to react to it. And so, again, our company is not about denigrating meat in any way or vilifying meat. It's simply about trying to provide a new type of meat that we think is better for the consumer, and that, if we get it right, the consumer will run to it as opposed to feeling they have to sacrifice something. They'll embrace it because they love it.
So because of that knowledge, people are starting to incorporate these type of meals into their diet. They're doing things like Meatless Monday. They're becoming flexitarians. They're doing things like becoming vegan before 6 p.m. All these steps are steps in the right direction that people are embracing because they understand, correctly so, that they'll be healthier for doing it. And finally, there's a large contingent of the population that cares deeply about greenhouse gas emissions and what that's doing with global warming, and they're starting to incorporate more plant-based foods into the diet as well, mostly because eating plant-based foods, we eat more efficiently, and we eat more efficiently, we're having less of an environmental impact.
When they first hear about these things called Meatless Monday, they say, what is this? Is this some type of animal rights movement, or what are you guys doing? I'm a vegan. I believe in the protection of animals. I think animals should be treated in a humane way, but this is not about Molly the cow. This is about Dolly, your child. And once parents saw the connectivity and got past the rhetoric, they realized that, wait a minute, my son's asthma is connected to the days he's missing from school, is the food he eats, the dairy, milk doesn't do your body good, the sort of allergies that my children has experienced, the lethargic feeling from sugar, the excitement, the crashes, is all connected to the food, the fast food, the McDonald's. Once parents saw and they were educated, they became connected. And it was all about the documentaries, the information, and the free flow of communications that let people know it's about nutrition. It's about healing people, and there's a different response from the parents because of that.
At the end of the day, everything is about education, and we as a society are becoming more educated about not only the benefits of a plant-based lifestyle, but the damages that can be caused by a non-plant-based lifestyle, not only to our health, but also to the environment, to the animals. And, people are waking up. The demand is there, and, tastes are changing. The consumption of beef and consumption of certain dairy products is decreasing, and therefore these big companies are finally also waking up. And, they're jumping on the bandwagon. I think it's great.
I think today there's more awareness than there's ever been before about the benefits of eating a plant-based diet, and individuals are starting to make that move. They're voting with their dollars, they're supporting businesses that are not abusing animals and destroying the planet. And so I am optimistic. I think we're at a better time now than ever before in terms of people recognizing the benefits of a vegan lifestyle.
So veganism is exploding all over Europe, particularly in Germany, where in 2012 there were, I think, 1% of product launches were vegan products, and last year over 13% of product launches were vegan products. So it's really taking off. It's just getting so much easier and more convenient for people to adopt a plant-based lifestyle. So we're seeing a huge surge in the UK and in Germany of people adopting a vegan diet now, which is great.
There is huge momentum in the vegan movement. It's exploding around the world, and I've traveled around the world for Jane Unchained documenting this, from Prague to Vienna to London to Bath, England, where I ran across a gourmet vegan restaurant. Everywhere, Israel. It's a global movement, and when enough people, maybe 8-10% of the population has that aha moment, the rest will follow.
When I look at the success of what I might call sort of this vegan cultural tsunami, which has come in with restaurants and products and books and former presidents who are going vegan, and all the top athletes also, you notice, are all starting to do vegan diets, whether it's for endurance or shorter recovery times or whatever. What does that due to? It's due to, I think, the fact that several different motivations, whether it's health, whether it's the environmentalists who made it super clear to us a decade ago that getting away from animal products was the kindest thing you could do to the earth, or even to that thing that every 8-year-old kid knows, that are you really going to do all that to animals? And culture has kind of shut that voice down, but the lid has blown off it. And people say, you know, you can be healthy and be kind and be an environmental steward all at the same time. Somehow those three things are coming together now, and people are saying, let's do it. And then they discover it's fun. It's fun. It's new taste. It's new products. It's a new relationship with your body. And perhaps best of all, you can look at your kids in the eye and say, we're on a diet that for you is not just foods that are over time are going to hurt you. These are foods that are going to save your life, and they're going to keep our family together for a longer period of time. That's a great thing.
What we don't want in society is to have to force people to make changes on the food that they're purchasing and eating, and they don't enjoy it. Who wants to go through life not enjoying the food they're eating? Instead, how about we produce food where people actually enjoy eating? And guess what? A side benefit is that it's better for the world. And that's the type of technologies that have been developed over the years in producing these new type of plant-based proteins. These plant-based proteins that are creating these mock meats or faux meats, whatever wants to call them, these type of products are making it easier for whether you are the most ardent carnivore in the United States, or you don't really like the taste of meat but you're trying new things, or anywhere in between. You can enjoy these foods and still be satiated, you can still be happy eating it, and we don't have to worry about these ethical consequences that we have when we buy factory farm products.
With that said, I also think that those kinds of products can be good transitional products for people who want to embrace and incorporate more of a plant-based diet, because it allows them to transition when people say, how could I ever live without meat? You know, well, these are some great products that can still approximate the way meat tastes and get you that same meat flavor that is so ingrained almost, in our history for millions of years to be thinking about eating meat. So I think that I look at them as almost a great stepping stone product to transition, and where they grow in the marketplace, time will tell.
If we're going to win, and when I say win, reduce a mass amount of suffering in this world for farm animals, we win when people make choices that aren't necessarily for ethical reasons, but they're because they're just better for them, like taste, cost, convenience. But with taste, cost, convenience, buying products that are also better for the world. If we can combine all of that, we're going to have the type of impact I know that we all want to achieve.
Well, first of all, if we're going to talk dietary, the options now, the startups, the young people who have said, no, I'm going to make a difference because not only do I live this way, I'm now going to put my money where my mouth is, and I'm going to create the kind of companies that will give people choices to move them away from cruelty, to move them away from, environmental destruction and everything that comes with that, with your choices. They said something really important in Food Inc. I remember they said that every time you eat, you're voting for your health, but you're also voting for so many things. You're voting for what energy you're putting out into the world, what energy you're putting into an animal, what energy you're putting out into the environment. And I love that idea. You know, I say that a lot to people. You're voting with your dollar. You're voting with your fork. You are voting, and you want the outcome to be in your favor, or at least in the planet's favor, or in the animal's favor. So number one, there's so many companies now that are actually investing in this movement, because it has become a movement, don't you think? It's really now so different than just, I'm gonna eat a veggie burger, or I'm gonna like try a vegan restaurant. It's really become a thing where I'm seeing people of high intelligence who for so many years were not making this very intelligent decision, and kind of going, well, I know a lot about this issue, this issue, this issue, I'm into politics, this, that, and the other, but I'm going to ignore the animal issue, and I'm not going to give it the weight that it deserves in terms of what I'm fighting for. I remember when Al Gore made An Inconvenient Truth and was still, you know, his family was, you know, Angus beef farms, and they were knee-deep in red meat, and he was still eating meat himself. And I remember a lot of journalists, you know, kind of went after him and said, excuse me, I'm so sorry, so you're making this, but what about this? And that's when it wasn't a movement yet. It was more about, okay, certain people make dietary changes and other people fight for the environment. No, we're the same. We're the exact same animal. You cannot be a meat-eating environmentalist. It makes no sense. And now all the science is out, so that, and this is not crazy animal rights people. This is not just environmental groups. This is the NIH. This is the World Health Organization. You know, this is the UN. This is Time Magazine. This is mainstream. This is now mainstream science that is being reported to people who generally and usually wouldn't pay attention to this kind of information because they're not seeking it like we are, right? We're truth seekers. So I'm going out and I'm looking at, you know, what Greenpeace is posting and PETA and this and Wild Aid, and I want to know what's going on. But in the absence of that, how are you going to get this information? And now people have access to it because you know why? We're sick. We're so sick. And you were talking to me earlier about gut health and interviewing a doctor about gut health. It's one of my biggest passions. And what's interesting about, you know, when we talk about the meat industry and how it affects, you know, social, humanitarian, environmental, it also affects our health in the worst way. And, you know, if you care about nothing else, you care about yourself. Most people do. And now we have a way to reach people who may not care about animals, who may not give a rat's whatever about the environment, who may not care about other people, but they certainly don't want to suffer. And now we have a different way to get to them because we know fact that it's making us sick. And so because in the last 20 years this has become a movement, I think everything has really come together, and that's why this documentary is so important, because you're bringing together science, you're bringing together gut health, you're bringing together activists and business owners and people who are trying to get information out there so that people can make changes. That's what really matters now, because in the movement, how do we affect people from every angle? And that's what I'm seeing happen now that never happened 20 years ago. It's huge.
Dairy products raise a lot of controversies, and perhaps most surprisingly, dairy products do not build strong bones. Now, it's true, you need calcium for bones, but there's a lot of foods that have calcium in them, especially green vegetables and beans and other legumes. But when researchers have studied milk drinkers, kids who drink milk don't have any better bone integrity than kids who avoid milk. And at the end of life, the other end of life, older people, they don't have any better bone protection. They don't have any better protection against fractures if they're milk drinkers compared to non-milk drinkers. So you do need calcium, but you don't need dairy calcium, and you don't need milk at all. And you're better off without it.
It's not just the utter cruelty of dairy. Dairy is so highly acidic for the body that it's actually weakening not only your bone structure, but also, you know, we are intolerant of something that is made for a baby cow to grow into quite a large animal in a very short period of time. It's just not something our body can take. And so in the way that we reject it, I mean, it is, look at the prostate cancer rates in men. 70% is attributed to dairy. Breast cancer in women, I mean, this is something that is highly dangerous for our health. And it's something that I ask people to give up first.
Secondly, milk is the biggest source of saturated fat, and especially the milk products like cheese, where the fat is really concentrated. That saturated fat or bad fat contributes to heart disease, it contributes to diabetes, as well as contributing to obesity and weight gain. And in addition to that, there's a whole range of funny, not funny, but unusual conditions, inflammatory conditions that seem to remit when people get away from dairy. I'm talking about asthma and other respiratory problems, migraines, rheumatoid arthritis, skin conditions. It's been a little unclear why it is that dairy causes immune reactions. And to this day, I don't think we know. But what we do know is that when people get the dairy out of their diet, in many cases, those conditions improve or just go away. And there's nothing like helping a poor asthmatic kid who can't get through a ball game without coughing and sometimes needing to go to the emergency room. Take the dairy out of their diet and suddenly they can breathe. And they throw their medicines away. We see that all the time. And getting away from dairy is a really good idea.
Exactly 4 days into my first week as a vegan, all my health issues cleared up. It was like somebody waved a magic wand. And for the first time, I went through a day absolutely normal, and I went through a weekend absolutely normal. And I started getting my strength back. You know, it's terrible when you have stomach problems every day. You kind of get weak and miserable. So it was phenomenal. And of course, all the joining all the dots, it was crazy that everybody was talking about it and how the allergies, the food allergies that dairy gives you. And I had heard it several times, but nobody had actually said, you could be going through a dairy allergy. So it was fantastic. I got better, and I called up all the doctors who told me that you work with animals and that's why you fall sick. And I called them up and said, not that I work with animals, I was eating animals, without realizing it, calling myself a vegetarian. I was consuming something from an animal, and that's what wasn't agreeing with me. It wasn't working with animals that wasn't agreeing with me.
My little sister was born with cleft lip and cleft palate. She has cholesteatoma, which if you don't know, that's tumors of the ears. And so diet has always been a big thing for us in general, but to go completely vegan was a new idea. And so when my sister committed to that, and we actually got to see the results in the scans of the tumors inside of her ears and the way that they had shrunk just within a 5-month period was unbelievable. My whole family was sold at that point.
Being that I was diagnosed as a vegetarian with osteopenia, which is the early signs of osteoporosis, with milk, which they say does a body and bones good, and seeing a couple of documentaries that combated that fact, my osteopenia is gone as a vegan now, and so is my anemia. And so I became living proof of what I was digesting.
So you're eating a clean source of protein, you're getting antioxidants, you're getting phytonutrients, which are antioxidants. And so here I am eating all this good quality protein, gaining muscle, burning fat. And I started transforming my body and started looking less like a doctor, more like a fitness competitor. That was really awesome.
Physically, I felt much, much stronger in the gym, because when I was eating meat, I was definitely eating a lower carb diet, high protein. And then, so when I made that switch, I was eating a lot more fruit and rice and things that I kind of stayed away from before. And I instantly felt so much stronger. I had a lot better pumps in the gym. Like, I felt like my muscles were so much more fueled. And on top of that, my digestion was so much better, because especially eating like a typical bodybuilder diet where you're eating like chicken and animal products, your digestion gets really, really terrible. And I would feel bloated and heavy. And after a few weeks of eating vegan, I started to feel so much lighter and better.
Now I do train every single day, and the recovery time of my training has been phenomenal. I found the inflammation inside my body completely decreasing. I used to have a lot of inflammation in my feet, and now that I train and have this plant-based diet, I hardly ever feel that.
It's saved me a lot of headaches. I don't buy medicine. I don't buy over-the-counter drugs. I don't have any ailments that I have to go visit a doctor for, so that essentially is also saving me money and time at the gym. I very rarely get to the gym these days. I don't have a gym membership anymore. You know, it's done wonders for my bank account, my pocket, but also preventive medicine. This is the natural life here.
Well, I was an athlete a long time ago, long time ago. And they knew that I had aspirations to be a professional baseball player. So they had fear that me becoming vegetarian and eventually vegan, I wouldn't be able to get the protein necessary or the calcium necessary or all these other issues that folks perhaps are concerned about without knowing all the facts. And so at first they were skeptical that I could do it in a way that was healthy. However, once I did it, they saw I became healthier than I was before. I actually gained more energy. My asthma dissipated. My athleticism actually increased. And so they have certainly been won over. And I hope I'm a good example for others who are looking to make that change as well.
I've been eating basically a vegan diet for 15 years. I run 5 or 6 miles every other day. I go to the gym, I do yoga. I'm 53. I do everything I did when I was 30. And, you know, you can only prove that over time, but like my energy levels and just sense of well-being and digestion and everything is way better than it's ever been in my life.
I've been vegan for a long time, and I know that many people who have been eating meat and then become vegan as they do different athletic things have said that it helps them recover better. I don't really have too much to compare it to because I've been active all my life, but I didn't start doing marathons until just a few years ago. And I've now done 6 of them. I've done a number of triathlons, including an Ironman. And I did this starting in my late 40s and early 50s, mainly to show that it was possible for longtime vegans to participate in these pretty serious athletic feats. And I do fairly well at them, but you know, I'm not an elite athlete. And you have elite athletes, people like Scott Jurek, winning the Western States 100-mile race 7 times in a row as a vegan, the only U.S. weightlifter, male weightlifter, to make the Olympics in Rio was a vegan. So you can get all the nutrients you need, not only to survive, but to thrive on an entirely plant-based diet.
Athletes like Anthony Mullally, an Irish international rugby player at 252 pounds, one of the largest rugby players in the UK, recently adopting a vegan diet and reporting no adverse effects in terms of losing mass or anything like that, actually reporting quicker recovery times and that he's been able to train a lot harder than previously when he was following a meat diet. So yeah.
One of the most common questions people have is, where do you get your protein? Now, the dietetic world tackled this 50 years ago and showed that a plant-based diet has loads of protein, which is why if you go out into a rural area and you see a bull, a stallion, or go to the zoo and you see the tallest giraffe and the biggest elephant, these are vegans. They're obviously getting protein from somewhere. And the way to think about protein is actually a little different. People think protein is meat, and then there's vegetables and grains and fruits that must not have protein in them. But if you send them to a laboratory, you find they all have protein in different amounts. And if you ate nothing but rice and beans, you would get more than enough protein, even if you are a finely trained athlete.
You know, we're bombarded with this idea that we need to eat animal foods to get adequate protein. In fact, we can get all the protein we need from plant sources. There's even protein in potatoes and broccoli. But for higher sources of protein, there are beans, tofu, soy milk, nuts, seeds. There's all kinds of ways that we can get all the protein we need. And just eating a balanced, whole foods, plant-based diet, I think, is really the best nutritional advice.
Let's talk about soy. There's so many myths around soy. I find it ironic that the pervasive myth that soy contains estrogen, when in actual fact it contains absolutely no estrogen. Soy contains phytoestrogens, which sound a lot like estrogens, but they're actually, when consumed, phytoestrogens compete at the same receptors as estrogen and actually lower the effect of circulating estrogen, which is why soy is protective against breast cancer. However, cow milk actually contains estrogen, and you know, not enough people know this. You know, they're worried about estrogen in soy milk. but they're consuming cow milk. It doesn't make any sense.
Calcium, green leafy vegetables and beans are the healthiest sources. And I do encourage people to supplement with vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is not made by plants or animals. It's made by bacteria. And some people will say, okay, before modern hygiene, the bacteria in the soil, on plants, on our fingers, in our mouths, would create some B12. I don't know if that's true. It's true that you only need a tiny trace. But to be safe, I encourage people to either take a multiple vitamin or some other source of vitamin B12. You're going to be fine.
Now, people always have this struggle, like, okay, I want to eat healthier, but what should I eat? And then we tend to relate a vegetable diet, a vegan diet with high-income people, or where I can only go to supermarkets that are super expensive. That is absolutely nonsense. We're talking about legumes, beans, chickpeas, brown rice, oatmeal. Those foodstuffs are completely cheap.
And the irony is that the vegan message now in countries like the US is seen as elite. And there are many wealthy people who are vegan. And I think one of the reasons for that is because they've looked at the issues and they've made informed choices. And they do have the wherewithal to purchase, whatever food they want.
I often get told by followers or the community online that I interact with, or even family members and friends, that veganism is just for rich people. I wish you rich people would shut up. It's convenient for you. You guys have private chefs, etc. But that's not true at all.
And it's not really expensive. That's a myth. I mean, of course, you want to go and buy all these fancy superfoods and go to the most expensive stores here in Southern California. You can spend a fortune trying to eat. But you can also go to a farmer's market and buy a head of cauliflower and go home and make a cauliflower steak with some amazing sauce and spend $6. And it's like one of the best things you've ever had.
Go to the store and try to buy a bag of beans and see how cheap they are. Those are protein-rich, healthy food that all doctors would tell you you should introduce them into your diet. Buying a head of lettuce, buying kale, buying some of the other basic needs, lentils, legumes, oatmeal, good steel cut oatmeal. You could buy a box of steel cut oatmeal that will last you for the entire week. So when you start to really do an analysis and step outside the paradigm and believe that it's not something that's affordable, that is not true. It is extremely affordable to have a plant-based. It is more affordable than having a traditional American diet.
This is not punishment. It can be delicious food, but what you notice is that we've taken the meat and the dairy and the eggs out of it, and everything that's left is all healthy.
Now, if you're looking at plant-based meats, at this point it's a different story. If you compare vegetarian chicken made from things like pea protein or soy protein, at this moment in time, it's more expensive than chicken that comes from an animal. However, the indication is that that's going to change. We're starting to see now plant-based meat companies reduce the cost of the products and be able to create these products in a way that's a lot more affordable, in a way that's a lot more efficient to get to consumers. So it's just a matter of time until we get to the point when plant-based meats and meat from animals are very close in cost, and I have no doubt in the future that plant-based meats actually become more affordable.
If we can create plant-based meat that basically replicates animal-based meat, if we can produce meat through cellular agriculture, clean meat, which is exactly the same thing, except without the sustainability and the climate change and the pathogen concerns, those things, once they are convenient and delicious and cost competitive, those things can displace animal-based meat, dairy, and eggs and solve these very big problems that conventional animal agriculture poses.
The future of food consists of focusing more on plant proteins, less on animal proteins, and on the animal protein side most likely come from cells that are duplicated within settings without the use of actual live animals. And so those cells turn into flesh, flesh turns into muscle, muscle turns into meat. It's a lot more efficient way to eat meat than to create an animal right from the start. Even Winston Churchill talked about this. It's sad it's taken this long, but we're getting closer than ever before.
The future is two things: tons and tons and tons of vegan food options. Now that could be vegan cheeses, vegan meats, but it could also be a reawakening to whole foods. Oh my goodness, fruits and vegetables and greens. That's all I really need to eat to be healthy. And then the other thing is lab-grown meat. And I personally look forward to lab-grown meat because I want to feed it to like my cats. I want to have a huge animal sanctuary where I can have big cats, big carnivores, small carnivores, snakes, anybody who needs rescuing, and I can feed them actual meat where no animals are harmed. Like it's vegan meat, which is just like, wait, what? Like it, that it doesn't even make sense, but that's what it is. No animals harmed is vegan. So that's what I think the future of food is. Just more and more vegan options, combined with a reawakening to whole foods and lab-grown meat.
When I look toward the future of food, what I'm really seeing is, number one, I think more and more people are going to take advantage of what we have learned. We now know that by changing what's on your plate, if you've got diabetes, that can get better. Sometimes it even goes away. There are ways to help people tackle their weight, tackle their cholesterol, their blood pressure, that allow them, instead of taking more and more medication, having more and more side effects, to exactly reverse that process.
I went to Nairobi recently. Honestly, vegan was a totally new concept in Nairobi, but there was already a vegan Facebook group, maybe with 10 or 15 followers, but it was there. So a few people knew about it, but I had the greatest success in Nairobi that I've ever had anywhere. And this was for a few reasons. One is that 3 people who had done my 21-day program went and promoted it, word of mouth. But second, that the people who came were part of a community. They supported each other to get healthy, and so it's much easier for them. And so we got a lot of results in Nairobi. That's not to say that many people didn't follow it. Some people even got off our mailing list. But the number of followers is truly incredible for a place where there was nothing before. So I still believe that it's possible, everyone can do it, and we should all try to change the world. It has such deep implications, because if everyone turned vegan, we would eliminate starvation, we would eliminate the problem of lack of biodiversity, losing of forests, lack of water, pollution. Livestock produce more greenhouse gases than all the vehicles on the planet. We could reverse climate change, and for our children to have a future, that's important.
It's not so complicated. I'd love to give a really exotic example of what I think the future of food is, but I think we're really going back to where we started in a way, but in a more sustainable way, more around plants, because their footprint is smaller, they're better for our body, they're better for the environment. It's a very natural way of eating.
I believe veganism will be the takeover. However, we still have to be very conscious in how we're packaging foods, processing those foods, whether they be fruits or vegetables. GMO free is the future.
The food in a whole new generation is reacquainting themselves with the soil. They have been disconnected for so long, and now they're coming back to their roots, the soil.
I think that we're all realizing that the solution is at the end of our fork, and I believe that that's exactly what we're going to see in the future. And I believe with that, we're going to see a decrease in all these illnesses. I believe with that, our children are going to be off of this ADD medication. I believe that with this diet, we can literally be our best selves, and that's exactly why I do this, and I believe that so many others do this as well, is to fulfill our purpose here and increase our longevity while we're here and our quality of life.
Let's say 10, 15 years ago, people would hear about lifestyle modification until they're sick, until they were sick and they would attend to a medicine consult and talk to their physicians, and the physician would say, you know what, you need to change this, this, and that. What we're seeing right now is that people are saying, wait, I don't want to have this disease, so I better start eating healthy. And that's a major cultural shift. I believe that this change of thinking is actually going to save humanity.
I'd have patients with ulcerative colitis, and I'm thinking, okay, it's a gut bacteria imbalance. Great, let's fix that. So I tell them, listen, eat a lot of fiber. Can you listen? Would you listen to me? And they're like, yes, I am all ears. Like, remember, I have a lot of leverage at this point because I have patients who are having severe diarrhea, blood in their stool, bleeding out. joint problems, they can barely walk, they can barely get out of bed, they have to quit their jobs. So I tell them, stop eating animal products, stop eating all meat, yes, including fish, and dairy. Increase your fiber to about 70 grams a day. Basically, everything going through your body has nutritional value. No empty calories, no processed foods, no refined sugars. We're going to give you nutritious food. They come back, the diarrhea has stopped, the bleeding has stopped, the joint pain is gone. Why? Because it's an anti-inflammatory diet.
When I started, nobody knew the word vegan. There were maybe 10 vegans in all of India when I started teaching this. Everybody thought I was crazy, including the center where I work, the other healers. But I knew what I was doing, and I left all my other work, which was very lucrative, to do what I believed in. And people saw this. Initially, my first patients were people who had one foot in the grave. They were the ones who were willing to do everything I said. And many of them are alive today. I mean, 12, 13, 15 years later, people who had one foot in the grave are alive and doing well. This is because they were ready to listen. And this message spreads by word of mouth. One person gets better, they want to tell the whole world about it. And I think that's the only way. So it will take some time. We can't put advertisements in the newspaper, nobody believes it. We can't put out flyers or posters, nobody cares. But every single person that gets better spreads it. And today there are vegan restaurants, and there's, so many vegans all over the world, all over India. Every city has a vegan Facebook group. Every city has vegan meetups. That's just in 10 years. So I think that's pretty amazing.
So I have one client who was vegan for a while, and she was actually, before she went vegan, she was considered obese. So she was very, very overweight. I coached her for a few months, and then she kind of went off trying to, do her own thing, and then she came back and she needed my help. And so over the summer, I coached her through a summer program and completely vegan diet, and she's lost about 20 pounds. And she has sent me multiple messages like that have made me so emotional, because I'm just so happy to know that, sorry, I don't want to cry. I'm just really happy to know that I can help people achieve their fitness goals, and they're doing it completely cruelty-free, and they're feeling better. And then at the same time, they're showing other people what you can accomplish on a plant-based diet.
Speaking at the Ivy League schools and the Ivy equivalent schools about animal agriculture, there's a pretty high level of awareness today, certainly as opposed to when I would speak at these schools 15 and 20 years ago. Most of the students at Harvard Business School or the Yale School of Management or wherever else, most of them are fairly familiar with the sustainability and the climate change issues, less familiar with cruelty to animals and the health ramifications, but still somewhat familiar. But students are excited. Students want to change the world. Students want their vocational lives to be meaningful. So you go in and you tell students, hey, you can make a good living improving the world by supporting alternatives that people want to consume. There's tremendous enthusiasm and excitement for that.
I've experienced a lot of, I guess I would call them hard cases, where somebody is a dedicated carnivore, omnivore, meat eater, doesn't really believe in a plant-based diet, is not convinced that they could ever enjoy a plant-based meal. I was just in Chicago at the National Restaurant Association. They seated a vegan and an omnivore at the counter while I was doing a demo, and he was a tough case. But I served him our heirloom tomato lasagna and our cacao avocado pudding and a couple other dishes, and I mean, he loved it. He ate the entire thing, and it's really about showing people that they can still be satisfied, they can still enjoy flavor, And he said, yeah, I actually believe I could do this. And I've seen a lot of people actually do it as well. Not because of me necessarily, but we're doing our part in trying to help change the world.
I am completely convinced that one day in the not too distant future, we will, as a society, see the idea of growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat the animals as insane. And technological development is going to be responsible for relegating that inefficiency to the dustbin of history.
One of the most important things that I understood from this journey, that I can only go but so far in my knowledge. I was able to bring down my diabetes and reverse those other conditions from my basic knowledge. But if we want to reach the level of optimum health, you must connect with a plant-based doctor. And when I connected with a plant-based doctor who was able to actually assist me to go to optimum health, it was a difference beyond imagination. So no patient or no person who's going through a chronic disease should attempt to do this on their own. But if they walk into their doctor's office and their doctor's office is not talking about reversal, they need to find another doctor. They need to find a doctor that has embraced the belief that food heals. And with that doctor as a team, they will be able to receive the optimum health that they deserve.
The great thing about a vegan diet is all of the side effects are good ones. Slimmer, healthier, younger. It doesn't cure everything, don't get me wrong. I mean, there are times where people can be ill, but there are no disadvantages of getting the animal products out of your plate and eating a healthy plant-based diet.
To me, being vegan is an aspiration to live as kindly as possible.
For a very long time, the human-animal relationship has been based primarily on violence and domination. And the animal protection movement's goal is to transform that relationship, to make it one that's based more on compassion and respect. Now, it's very hard to imagine that type of a world, a truly humane society where we don't view animals merely as commodities to be exploited in whatever heinous ways that we want. But lots of things have seemed impossible that, in hindsight, end up appearing inevitable. I mean, think about in our own country, for example. 150 years ago, the legitimate social debate in our country was whether one human being ought to be able to own another human being. 100 years ago, the legitimate social debate was whether more than half the population ought to even be able to vote. 50 years ago, the legitimate social debate was whether blacks and whites ought to be able to drink from the same water fountain. Even just 10 years ago, the legitimate social debate was whether gay Americans deserve the same rights as other Americans. Today, though, if you take the wrong side on those, if you say you're for slavery or that you're against women's suffrage or you're for racial segregation, in almost any part of the country, you would be a complete social pariah. What a blink of an eye ago, historically speaking, was totally acceptable to hold as a view, today would make you into a pariah among your social group. And so think about what that might mean for animals. Now, that's not to suggest a moral equivalency between all of these causes, but it is to say that things which seemed impossible to happen ended up in hindsight appearing inevitable. But they were never impossible and they were never inevitable. They were only made possible by the hard work of social justice advocates who progressed our society in a more humane manner. And so I'm convinced that future generations are going to look back in utter revulsion at the ways in which we so commonly abused animals, especially farm animals, in our era. And they're going to wonder, how could anyone have sat idly by while billions of individuals were tortured on a daily basis for the most trivial reasons? People in the future are not going to have a kind judgment on our relationship with our fellow creatures on this planet. Increasingly, we're starting to recognize that. We're starting to recognize that just in the same way that Copernicus and Galileo helped us to see that we aren't the center of the physical universe, we're now starting to recognize that maybe we're not the center of the moral universe either. That maybe instead of thinking of these animals as being merely here for us, they're actually here with us. And that is a changed mindset that is not going to look well when we think back on what we were doing to animals at the beginning of the 21st century.